Love, I say this in the book, love isn't an emotion. We describe it as an emotion. It's not actually an emotion. It's far too complex to be an emotion. So there could be that some people with very high levels of testosterone will be more likely to seek mates outside their relationship. Because I think what a lot of people are doing is raising their children and thinking this partner is a great co-parent. I love them for that. They've been amazing, but oh my God, I could literally have another 30 or 40 years. Is this the person I want to do that 30 or 40 years with now? We've gamified the whole thing. It's led to very extreme mate choice behaviors where we've got, I'm afraid, generally men who like everybody and women who then have to be ultra, ultra, ultra picky because otherwise they get too many matches and can't deal with them. That terrifies me because your relationships with humans based on biobehavioral synchrony are the things that bring you life satisfaction, are the things that underpin your longevity, your mental health, your physical health, your happiness. You know, if you replace that with a robot, it's all a bit rock and roll at the moment in terms of the evidence, but it's hard to say whether or not really monogamy is even the best structure for a child to be raised in these days.
God's apology for your family. I think I read that
One
at
of my
some.
interviewees said that.
Anna Machin, author of the beautifully written and fascinating book, Why We Love. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciated the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Okay, so let's start by, the obvious question is what is love? Can you define it?
Oh, that's the hardest question. I've been spending 20 years trying to answer that one. What can I say? What is love? Love at the kind of most basic level consists of two dimensions. Okay, so it's the biological dimension and the social dimension. And the biological dimension of love is things like your genetics, your neural activity, your neurochemical levels, your psychological mindset, your attachment, things like that. And then the social dimension of love is things like social rules, politics, religion, media, all those sorts of things. And all of those mixed together to come up with your individual experience of love. So it's really hard to say what love is like in a single answer, because first of all, it's got a subjective element. So it means that it's whatever it is to you. And from a scientific point of view, there are many, many variables that feed into love. So we can answer it at the evolutionary level, love is survival. We can answer it at the psychological level, love is attachment. We can answer it at the neurochemical level, love is a mixture of 4 different neurochemicals in your brain. At the sort of neural level, we can say it's this particular set of brain activations. And all of those are the answer to the question, what is love? But the reason why I wrote the book is in the past, people have sort of come up with one answer. And actually, that's not the case. There isn't a single answer to the question. It's very, very complicated. And I actually like that complexity because I think it represents to us how important love is. Because actually, love engages every fiber of your being. Every biological mechanism in your body is engaged in love, and every facet of your daily life is reflected in love. So actually, it's a really, really complicated phenomenon. And I think we're just really lucky to experience it the way we do.
Do you think can everybody experience love? Can human beings in general experience love, or are there some people do we know of that it simply isn't possible from a neurochemical biological perspective?
We cannot definitely say that some people don't experience love because we simply don't have the tools to get into that level of intervention with them. There are some people who struggle more, and maybe their feelings of love are maybe not as intense as other people. So we all have the same neurochemistry, but we all exist at different baseline levels of that neurochemistry. So people who have sort of higher levels of those neurochemicals tend to feel love more powerfully. For example, they tend to be motivated more to be in love. They tend to get a greater reward from being in love, all those sorts of things. So if you are somebody who exists at a low level of those, then your experience of love and maybe your sensation of love is going to be very different. Some people are genetically predisposed, again, to seek out love, to get a greater hit of neurochemistry from love, and other people aren't. So I don't think there's anybody who's completely absent to love. Some people say, well, some people can't empathize, but empathy is one aspect of love. It's not the totality of love, for example. And we all have, for example, an attachment style. So I think there aren't people who experience zero love, but there are people who struggle with love and maybe don't have the same intensity of experience as some people do. Yeah.
Very good. When I was reading your book, I was asking myself the question, not only why do people fall in love, but why do people fall out of love? What's your perspective on falling out of love?
Falling out of love, I mean, there's again lots of different answers to that. From a psychological point of view, it's it's a pulling away from somebody. Generally, it's based on a behavioral withdrawal first. So behavior is kind of at the basis of all the neurochemical activity we see, which underpins love. So, and those behaviors are things like, touching, hugging, laughing, being together, conversation, all those things that we do to try and bond a relationship, emotional vulnerability, using love language, all those sorts of things. And when you start, I don't know, it might be something as little as somebody's really irritating you, or there's something about them, you start to withdraw behaviorally. And because you
Okay.
withdraw behaviorally, you start to withdraw psychologically. So you might start moving away from maybe a secure attachment to a more insecure attachment. And because you're not doing the behaviors of love, you're getting less and less of the neurochemistry of love. And neurochemistry of long-term love is addictive. So as you withdraw, it's a little bit like going out into withdrawal from like a heroin addict. If you do it slowly, you
Mm.
don't tend to get the massive cold turkey effects. You don't get sort of the physiological withdrawal experience. And if you do it slowly, so you start getting sort of a lower and lower neurochemical hit to that person. And the addiction gets less and less, and the reward gets less and less. And eventually you'll get to the point where you're like, well, there's no physiological mechanism bonding me to this person anymore. And from a psychological point of view, there might be various aspects that you're finding difficult about them. You're not using the practices that maintain relationships. And eventually the whole thing will get to a point where it's so tenuous and the neurochemistry of love is so low that really there's nothing keeping you together any longer. And that's generally why people fall out of love, is because there's this slow withdrawal. Sometimes obviously you have the big bang of a breakup, but what you'll tend to find with people who suddenly break up, I don't know, maybe there's an affair or something, because actually they haven't fallen out of love, and that's what makes it difficult. It's love is not something that can go like that. It has to dissipate over time. And if you're dumped, or if you suddenly, for whatever reason, a relationship comes to an abrupt end, the reason why it's so partly painful is because you're going through this physiological withdrawal of this sort of drug addiction. And that makes it very, very painful, both physiologically and psychologically.
The neurochemistry that you talk about is fascinating in the book. You mentioned, I'm going to quote a line here that it really jumped out to me. You say that the opioid system is the chemical of long-term love. Okay.
Mm.
So obviously that would infer that there's an addictive quality, right? Attributed to the feeling of being in love, which would also indicate a withdrawal effect after its loss,
Yes.
right? So that's where I was going with that. Um, there's an immense amount of jeopardy associated with the experience of love, particularly when it breaks down. So is it possible to retrieve and recover? Right. So we spoke about when we fall out of love. Is it possible to retrieve, recover, and rebuild? Or is the whole novelty and the whole joy of meeting and the all, is that all done?
No, of course it is possible. And, some relationships go through the most amazing traumas and manage to come back together and survive. I think we need to just sort of separate the stages of love. So the bit where you meet and you've got that amazing thrill and that amazing euphoria and that amazing obsession,
Mm,
that's attraction. That's the attraction, lustful stage of love. And that doesn't last forever because you move into long-term love. And the attraction, lustful stage is underpinned by a different set of neurochemistry than long-term love. So the endorphin opioid element of love is not there in the attraction stage. But certainly if you have a deep trauma, but you manage to work together and bring it back together, it certainly can come back. And some people say it can come back stronger because in a way you've learned maybe what you've done wrong, and because you've had to work and because you've had to really learn the rules of maintaining a relationship, of what the practices of maintaining a relationship are, you keep those going in the sort of second half of the relationship. Because I think what a lot of people don't realize is how much work a relationship takes. One of the major characteristics of love is maintenance. And one of the ways we characterize loving relationships in more ambiguous circumstances, for example, the love of God, if you want to define, is the love of God actually a relationship love? One of the things we look for is there maintenance in that relationship? The answer is yes, by the way. But I think maintenance is very important. So yes, you can certainly come back for it. It's very hard. You have to get over the scarring that occurs. You have to get over the probably drastic shift from secure attachment to insecure attachment. But we know attachment profiles can shift, and you would have to do a lot of work. You'd have to, work very hard to lower your cortisol levels. Cortisol, which is the stress hormone, in the long term isn't very friendly towards love chemicals. It tends to obscure their effects. So there's a lot of work in terms of taking the stress out of the relationship. and trying to allow those neurochemicals free reign again by doing the practices that release them, things like, you know, touch and conversation and being together. And so it takes a lot of work, and anyone who's been in that situation will tell you that. But I think as long as the two people have the will and they have the humility to say, this is going to take a lot and we're going to have to work really hard because there's a lot of stuff that needs to be rectified, then yes, of course it can work.
Do men and women experience love differently?
No, it's a myth. They don't. There's more individual differences, I would say, within the sexes than between the sexes. So if you look at the neurochemical profiles of you know, a population, there's no distinction along sex lines. If you look at the brain activations, there's no difference. So in terms of what they're experiencing, the neurochemical basis, the sensations of love, no, there's no evidence. Where it does differ is in the stories we tell our children as we bring them up. So the fact that there may be differences in how people talk about love, how they describe love, is more likely to be a socially gendered and imposed view of how you should express love, how you should feel about love, how you should talk about love within your gender. That is what tends to impact along sort of, you know, male female lines. There's nothing biological that does that. And there certainly are cultures where we don't see those distinctions, where men are as free to speak of love, to express love, often between them and their male friends, which we in the UK might be going, you know, that's not what men do. So it's very much a gendered thing. It's a cultural thing rather than a biological thing.
Yeah, there is an issue in Northern European culture around male touching. I know that in one of your previous conversations you spoke about the fact that, like, and a friend of mine, a UK-based friend of mine, spoke about being in India and watching men holding hands as they're walking down the street, and this is just perfectly normal. I think in Ireland and the UK, we've a little distance to travel, a little bit of distance to travel before we get there. But maybe we will. So in terms of the breakdown of love, cheating. Why do people cheat? Is it novelty seeking? Is it mate switching? What's your perspective?
It really depends on what the motivation is within that individual. So there's no one answer as to why somebody might cheat. It could be there are some genes that predispose you to be more likely to cheat.
Wow.
One in particular, which is known as the AVPR gene, which is associated with a neurochemical that's sort of associated with love, but sort of on the side. There is some evidence that some people carry a version of the gene which makes them more liable to cheat, but obviously genes are not deterministic. So just because you carry that version doesn't mean that you will. Some people, it's a culture that they grow up in that actually this is what we do. And whilst we might define that as cheating, within their culture, they don't define it as cheating. That's not cheating. It's just something that people do. It can be something that's a slightly learned behavior. If you are brought up within a family where maybe your parents were unfaithful, and that was something you grew up with as being something that was kind of acceptable, then you are more likely to do it. There is some evidence, but it's kind of a little bit rocky as to maybe people with high levels of testosterone might be more liable to cheat. And that's because testosterone is, particularly in males, it is the hormone of mate seeking and mate competition. That's what it's there for. And that's why it drops when you finally couple up, and it drops again when you become a father, because actually it's not very helpful in those circumstances. But so there could be that some people with very high levels of testosterone will be more likely to seek mates outside their relationship. And for some people, you're absolutely right, it's novelty. Some people get bored in relationships, and some people like that, they prefer that early lustful attraction, exhilarating side of being in a relationship, and it might be something that they seek as a novelty outside their own relationship. So it's a mix of reasons, and there is no one reason why somebody might do it. Generally we see an interaction, so it might be that you have a genetic predisposition and you've got a family history of people who happen to cheat, and that's those two things together, that gene environment interaction, that makes it seem like more likely that you will.
As an evolutionary anthropologist, you would be interested in the evolutionary reasons as to why love came about, why we need love, right? And you talk about the role of survival and its fundamental part of human nature. And it's as when I was reading the book, I got the feeling that it's as important as water to the human being, right?
Yeah.
From an evolutionary perspective, is it essential in terms of raising families and raising children and bonding people together? could we not partner without love? I mean, why is it essential?
Um, No, you can't partner without love and raise a child. You can certainly partner without romantic love and raise a child. So there's
Mm,
a growing body of people now who actually raise children based on platonic love rather than
mm.
romantic love, and that works very well. But no, first of all, love is there is like the binding chemical because, as we all know, cooperating with other people, coordinating your life with other people is really stressful sometimes and really difficult, and you have to make a lot of accommodation for the way the other person acts, their personality, all those sorts of things. And in an ideal world, we would be solitary because there are costs to being with other people. Costs in terms of competition for resources, as I say, coordinating your day, that the increased likelihood that they will cheat on you, or they will lie to you, or they will steal from you, and all of these things are threats to your survival. So ideally, we would all drift around as solitary little bubbles. But because we're such a complex species, because we have children who are very tricky to raise, because there is so much knowledge, social, technological, that you need to know to be a human, that you can't learn just on your own. You need to rely on other people to teach it to you. Then we need other people for that. And we just need other people on a day-to-day basis to help us subsist. And so we need each other, but it's difficult. It's really tricky, and it is survival threatening to cooperate with other people. So love evolved to be that thing that sort of motivates us, rewards us for doing this really difficult thing. And in the past, I've kind of described it as biological bribery. At the most basic level, it is. It's these lovely set of neurochemicals that make you feel fantastic. You know, they make you feel great, and then they addict you to the person, so it's really hard to leave. And that's there to make sure that we do this very survival critical behavior. And you need it between reproductive partners because having a baby is really tough. So you need it there to do that. You need it between you and your child because, again, little babies are very, very tough. And you need something to make you get up at 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 in the morning. You need when it's really, really hard. And that is what love is there to do. It's to bind you to people who are critical to your survival. And and it is as important as water and food and shelter. You know, it's love. I say this in the book. Love isn't an emotion. We describe it as an emotion. It's not actually an emotion. It's far too complex to be an emotion. It's actually a fundamental life need. And it's at the very basic level of life need. And children, I mean, we can see that, for example, in children who don't have love. Children who don't have love have major developmental problems. They are much more likely to, as adults, you know, have poor mental health, have psychopathology, have addiction, exhibit antisocial behavior, not be able to build functioning, healthy relationships themselves. So having love as a child is absolutely fundamental to your whole life course.
You also say in the book that ultimately love is about control, which infers a darker, scarier aspect
Mm.
to it. But it is interesting. So it's a system of control as well, right?
Yes, I mean it's evolutionary control. You know, we are in a way pawns in the evolution game. All that evolution is interested in, if we were going to characterize it as a person, is getting those genes down the generations. I just want to get those genes down the generations, and the way I do that is you survive, you reproduce, you raise your children so they survive and reproduce, and on we go. And that's what we're trying to do. And so it's evolution's way of controlling us to do this difficult thing, which is cooperate and live with each other, just to make sure those genes go where they're supposed to go. So yes, it's a very light, you know, it's a benign control. It's actually a control. It's actually a phenomenon which is incredibly good for us from a health point of view, and for the most part, a nice positive experience. So you know, it's a benign control, but it is control. Yeah, absolutely.
You also said that friends are God's. I think you said this. Friends are God's apology for your family. I think I read that
One
at
of my
some.
interviewees said that. She
Was
did.
it?
Yeah, I still remember that. Yeah. She did. Yeah, they're your because friends, and we kind of we don't dismiss friendship, but we don't really give it the reward or the focus I think we should.
Yeah.
Um it, you know, it kind of comes down the hierarchies of love, you know, behind your romantic partner, behind your children, maybe behind your family. But friends are an amazing thing, and we're really lucky to have them. Not actually many species have friendship love, or indeed have friends. And we're lucky to have them because they serve a very particular purpose. For a start, they're the platonic relationship that you choose. You don't choose your family, you're kind of stuck with them. Whereas your friends are the people you choose. And from doing research, we know that friendships are kind of like a source of absolute unjudgmental relaxation. They are the people who can just buoy you up when it's really difficult. I mean, particularly talking to women about their friends, they say their friends are the people who've seen them in the good times and the bad times and love them just the same, because there's no judgment. I can go in there rather than, if I go and see my family, there's quite a lot of judgment. There's quite a lot of, you shouldn't be doing this, you should be doing that, too involved, too nitpicky about my life. I can go to my friends and they're just accepting. They're just like, yeah, okay, that's you. And so I think we dismiss friendship too quickly because it's where we get this solace in our lives. And certainly for a lot of women, and again in the book I talk about this, a lot of women are turning more to their friends to be their survival critical relationships. So they might have decided they don't want a romantic relationship, they don't want children. So actually we all need people in our life, we need love in our lives, otherwise we're at major detriment. So where's the next step for that? My friends. And they are, in fact, people sometimes refer to them as my chosen family or my logical family. And they are the people who will take me through life. And I think, we need to speak more about the importance of friendship, really. Because again, also for men see friendship really as their key source of relaxation. They really do. Their key source of humor and fun and just being able to be completely yourself.
You mentioned the word judgment there in non-judgment in platonic relations, which would infer judgment in romantic relationships, which can be problematic, right?
It can be. I mean, I think people talk more about judgment from their family than their friendships. I think judgment comes in terms of these people being your logical family and an unjudgmental family. I think within relationships, I think particularly when we look at heterosexual relationships, there's an inherent tension there simply because of the differences between men and women, and particularly the different ways in which men and women's cognitive processes occur. And therefore, there's always a bit of a tension in heterosexual relationships because of that sex difference in the way we operate within our world, and that's where sort of same-sex friendships are that release. So it's not necessarily judgment in romantic relationships; it's more that inherent tension that which we might always notice, but it is there. Which isn't there when you talk to your same-sex best friends or whatever.
What's the role of exclusivity in romantic relationships? Why is it so important?
Well, it's a debate as to whether it is important. It's actually down for me to individual choice. But I mentioned at the beginning we have a societal dimension of love, and there are many societies in the world which impose monogamy and say the correct way to have a romantic relationship is for two people to be exclusive. And that's a socially imposed monogamy. Now, the human species actually isn't 100% monogamous. In fact, there are no 100% monogamous species because that would be a mistake from an evolutionary point of view. Because if, as for example, a male of the species, if you can be in a monogamous relationship, investing in your offspring, all that, great. But if you can also have a few sneaky matings behind some rocks over there and get your genes flowing away the other way, then that's a good idea from an evolutionary point of view, because more genes are going to go down the generations than just within this exclusive pairing here. And if you're a female, you might be with the best investing, protecting, wonderful, wonderful man, kind, caring, but his genes might not be so hot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and have a mating over here with this guy over here who's really hot, but otherwise not particularly nice. And I'm going to then get this guy to raise this child. Now, it sounds horrible and brutal, and I'm afraid evolution is. But from an evolution point of view, that's why true monogamy doesn't exist, because even in the most monogamous of species that we think, like swans who mate for life, nope, they might mate for life, but they are off doing things with other swans. So it doesn't really matter. So we have imposed monogamy really as a way of controlling societies. So if everybody gave into all their biological urges and just rushed off and did exactly what they wanted, it would be kind of chaotic. And so when we get civilization and when we get structure and when we get people who are in power, they tend to impose, either from a legal point of view and or a religious point of view, a rule about who can marry who and how many people can be in that relationship. And generally in the West, it's monogamy, and it's imposed because then we can predict what everybody is doing. It's why, bigamy is a crime, because we can't have people doing that. It's chaos. So we're just going to impose this as again, a form of control. So monogamy isn't a biological imperative in humans, but it is a social imperative. And there is an argument to say that for a greater or lesser period of time, having monogamy when you are raising children is a more is an easier way to raise children, and some would argue is a better way to raise children. I would say, for me personally, the jury's out, but because there's not enough evidence. But yes, some people would say for greater or lesser period of time, it is better to have two people raising a child.
Why do you think the jury is out?
Because there is a growing body of work now saying that we now have quite a few families where we have multiple parents raising a child. And that might be it's a step family. It might be that it's a co-parenting family where, for example, we might have, you know, two couples who come together, raise a child, maybe a lesbian couple, a gay couple. Between them, they have produced children. And, you know, those children have two mums and two dads. And so you actually get quite a few children these days who have more than two parents. And as far as we can tell, as long as there is the relationship between those parents is not conflictual, and that that child is loved within that family, then really it has no effect on development and on happiness and outcomes for the child. So, you know, it's all a bit rock and roll at the moment in terms of the evidence, but it's hard to say whether or not really monogamy is even the best structure for a child to be raised in these days. Really, all children need. I mean, this is kind of like the controversy that came out when we started having, you know, gay parents. Oh gosh, they, you know, it's all the developmental outcomes going to be different. Da, da, da. And it's not, because actually all children want is love and security. And as long as you give them love and security, to be absolutely honest, it doesn't matter what the configuration of those parenting roles is.
And the problem, of course, in society is quite a lot of children don't have love and security.
No, and that is the problem. And they can be in a heterosexual, monogamous family, nuclear family, and not have love. And so actually, you know, it's not necessarily the best structure. It's actually what is the nature of the relationships within that family that matters.
There's a lovely piece in the book where you talk about love across cultures, and you mentioned in Arabic they have 7 different words for love, right? And sadly, in the English language, we only have one.
Yes,
love is love, right?
Very inadequate.
It's completely inadequate. How do you think love is it changing? Is society changing? How is love changing within society in terms of relationships? I'm thinking in terms of long-term relationships, marriage, etc. Right? How is it going to evolve, do you think?
I think if we talk about marriage, because I quite often in the last couple of years, I think I've sat on about 4 panels asking the question, is marriage doomed? Basically, is marriage going to die out? The answer to that is I don't think so. No, marriage is a very ancient ritual, and we need that ritual, and we need that social display of coupledom or whatever it might be to our wider society. So it won't die out, but I think it will change in terms of this idea of being married for life. Marriage for life was a concept when we had very short lifespans. Now you could literally be married for, God, you get married at 20, you're still around at 90. You know, you've been married for 70 years. That's like over someone's lifespan 100 years ago. And so I think we might see more and more of there being more people having a sort of a succession of relationships, or a succession of, you know, good, solid, you know, relationships, you know, 2 decades, 3 decades of relationships, but having several of those in their life, rather than it being, I'm going to be married for life. Because people do change across their life course. The needs that people have from that relationship change, you know. So you might have, you know, the marriage where you've raised your children, for example. And, you know, the relationship between the parents or the lovers in that relationship is very different. It's focused on the children. It's a very different family dynamic too, for example, when your children leave home and then it's back to the two of you. And we are seeing an increase, for example, in divorce rates, particularly prompted by women over the age of 50. Because I think what a lot of people are doing is raising their children and thinking, this partner is a great co-parent. I love them for that. They've been amazing. But, oh my God, I could literally have another 30 or 40 years. Is this the person I want to do that 30 or 40 years with now? Or do I want a different sort of life and a different personality opposite me? So I think, you know, we are seeing an increase in this idea of kind of a, you know, a marriage which is focused on children, and then a marriage that comes maybe later in life after menopause. Because, yeah, we just never anticipated, I think, that lifespans would be this long.
I spoke about this actually with Stephanie Regan, who's quite big over here in the Love and Relations podcast scene. And I proposed this idea. I think I have a great idea, and I think I know how to solve this, right?
Right.
But I want an expert's opinion. I'm thinking in terms of contracts, terms. So we'll say if you're going to have kids, you have an 18-year contract.
Yes.
And then with the option to renew. Right? which forces both of you. Stephanie made the point that people think they can say anything they want to each other in a marriage.
Mm.
People think that now that they're married, that the normal rules of engagement don't apply. And you can't,
Mm.
right? But if you have that contractual thing in place with the opportunity or the option to do, whether it's 10, 15, 20, 25 years, it will keep both of you invested in, I suppose, caring for each other. It'll stop the laziness. What do you think of that idea?
Well, I hate to say you're not the first person to have that idea.
Okay,
It's an
sadly.
idea that has been around. It's an idea that certainly has been actually discussed in sort of legal circles and those who work within family law as to whether that's a good idea, where you would have like I mean, some people suggest like every 5 years you
Mm,
review the marriage.
mm,
You sit down, you look at it, you either call your quits there and you take away from, you've agreed already what you're going to take away from that marriage, so it's not a horrible, messy divorce,
mm.
or you renegotiate the contract, say, right, we're going to do another 5 years. And so some people have suggested this might be an idea. I think it would depend very much on. The thing about humans is you never actually know what they're going to do when you throw these innovations at them. Some it might work, but it also might mean that people might drift for a bit, and then a bit like when you do some mass cramming for an exam just before something happens. So I'm
Mm.
really awful for 4.5 years, and then for the last 6 years I'm really 6 months are going to make a mess of it, and then you're going to be like, oh, okay. So I'm not sure whether it would work, but it's not an idea that has been dismissed out of hand as to whether or not it would be a good idea.
So you
Yeah.
would still be, based on research and evidence, and then you would still be in favor of marriage for life,
I don't think a marriage for, I think,
which is what it is right now.
I don't think you can I don't think you can say, let's review it in 5 years or 10 years or 20, because it's not a commercial contract. It's a
Mm.
contract that involves feelings and emotions, and people's very souls are sort of intertwined into those relationships. So I think it's difficult. I think we need to do something about divorce laws, but that's a whole other thing, because divorce is very complicated and people should be able to actually hold their hands up and go, do you know what, this isn't working, we need to walk away now, without all the distress that causes. So I think there is an issue there. But I think you should enter into it thinking this is going to be what it is for life. But I think we should make it not as conflictual and not as damaging to get out of, actually, if you decide that's what you want to do. Because we're all grown-ups. I think we can, we don't need the state to say to us, you can't get out of this situation very easily, because I think we have to allow people to do that.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll put my fantastic idea, which isn't original, to the
No,
side,
sorry.
okay, sadly. But okay, so what effect, I'm thinking in terms of technology, dating apps, what effect do you think dating apps are having on finding love, securing love, maintaining love? What's going on there?
It's all a little bit of a mess at the moment, I'm afraid, is the feedback I get from when I talk to people who use apps. When I do my public talks about the science of love, and the science of dating and all that kind of thing, I get a lot of my audience are quite young people. And a lot of them come because of their frustration with the way they are expected to find love in the modern world, which is using an app. And they don't find it works for them, particularly if they're looking for long-term relationships. And I think it is a bit of a mess now. I think there's quite a lot of apathy out there about dating apps. I think when they were first thought of, 20 years ago, I think the intentions were good from the people who developed them. This idea that we would use this new technology and people would be able to be introduced to many, many more different people. And, that's a good thing. And in one sense, one of the positives of dating apps has been opening up the fields to who you can actually date, particularly if you're in a more minority identity. So for a lot of LGBTQ plus people, they found it hard, particularly if they weren't out, to find somebody to go on a date with, particularly if you live in a small community. Whereas actually those apps that are focused upon those identities actually have helped people find somebody when it used to be quite difficult. So in one sense, they're great as an introduction tool. I don't like the fact they're called dating apps in a way, because you're not going to have a date on the app. That's not what it's for. And when people try to have a date on the app, that's when it all starts going a bit pear-shaped. So I think they're good as introduction tools, but the people who developed them didn't really take into account how humans behave. And their platforms now, it's kind of more of a game of trying to trip up the other side and kind of catch them. So, you've got people on dating apps who will like every single profile because that increases the likelihood of getting matches. But nobody likes every single person. But they're doing that because it's a better way of catching people.
Fishing.
Yeah. And that's not how it's supposed, humans do not date by fishing.
Mm.
You date by actually getting your brain engaged, using all this wonderful neural structure we have for, the brain is the best dating algorithm there is. We are really good at unconsciously picking who is attractive for us and is good for us. And we can't do that on an app because it begins in a sensory intake of information. Well, you don't get any sensory information from an app. You don't even get visual sensory information because the photo might have been filtered. It might not even be the photo of the person you think you're going out with. So we're restricting our ability to do it by going on an app. We've gamified the whole thing. It's led to very extreme mate choice behaviors where we've got, I'm afraid, generally men who like everybody and women who then have to be ultra, ultra, ultra picky because otherwise they get too many matches and can't deal with them. And we've allowed it to tap into the fact that humans are very good at sort of dithering. We're very good at prevaricating. And so apps allow you to, message backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and actually never do anything. And that's not really going to work if we're going to reproduce the species, is it, guys? So they're just not, they just don't work in the way that humans date and mate. They just don't work in that way. And I think we will get there with them. And I think, as with all new innovations, we're still in that learning process of actually what works, what doesn't work. But at the moment, they are too gamified. They bear no relation to how humans actually select partners. So somebody needs to spend a lot of time talking to people, I don't know, like me or psychologists, or to really understand before they decide they're going to design an app.
Well, they're fundamentally commercial ventures, right? So that's at the forefront of the thinking here is commerciality. And when you have financial interest at stake, and I would imagine they would include behavioral scientists and people like Anna Machin early in the process, because if you're going to gamify these things, you want somebody like Anna involved.
You would be surprised as to how many are developed without that input.
Mm.
It's more, or what you tend to find is people will pick on one piece of dating research. So, for example, similarity is important. Okay, similarity is kind of important. Sometimes it's not, sometimes it is, but it's not really a big factor, similarity. But there have been whole dating sites and apps built on, let's just find similar people. And that just refines down human dating to like one tiny aspect of human dating. And it's very unlikely you'll be that successful just focusing on that one tiny aspect of human dating. So I think we have to be more realistic about how nuanced human mating behavior is. And we have to attempt, if we can, to take away the gamification of it. Because it just doesn't work that way. And the other thing that's difficult, a lot of them rely on visual cues in terms, so a picture of the person, for example. And that's fine, we all want to know who we're talking to and etc. But unfortunately, that visual cues in terms of attraction are used more often by men. So those apps are more shifted towards how men pick dates, and more often in short-term relationships. So both men and women focus more on looks in short-term relationships than they do in long-term relationships. So immediately you've got a load of apps who are biased towards men selecting and also biased towards long-term relationships, which is why short-term relationships, sorry, which is why we get a lot of complaints saying, well, it's quite hard to find a long-term relationship on these apps because they just all seem to be on there just wanting a short-term thing. And I think that's one of the problems is, again, they've kind of, the platforms they're using aren't quite subtle enough in terms of how mating works. So I think we'll get, they're not going to go away, and they do have positive points, but I think we've come to a point in their development now where we really need to like stop and rethink how they should work.
Yeah, we're not going to put the genie back in the bottle. This is particularly with Gen Z millennials coming through. This is how they meet. So
the funniest thing is, though, at my talks now, they're all talking about going back to which I find quite hard because I don't think I'm that old-fashioned ways of dating, which is
Which
go
is
to a
which is
bar.
what are the old-fashioned ways? Going to a pub.
Go to a pub or meet somebody through a friend or meet someone at work or, yeah, join a club. You're just like, yeah, that's kind of that's kind of how you did it. But this is known as old-fashioned dating. So there we are.
Okay. So yeah, and meeting at work these days is
It's
kind of,
tricky.
but it was back in the day, it was the way so many couples partnered
Yeah,
up, right?
absolutely.
But
Yeah,
now it's filled with jeopardy and
it is.
peril.
It is.
So if you were designing a dating app, and I mean, you can't, there's some things you can't taste, smell, there's some
No,
things you just can't measure and can't convey across a dating
no,
app, right?
no.
One of the things that you've spoken about before that's really interesting is the sniff test. And let's
Yes.
have a chat about that because this is fascinating about how women are able to discern between men based on scent. And
Mm.
you say that men have lost this ability, is it?
Well, we don't know whether men have lost it or they never had it. It's quite hard to tell. You can't really tell from evolution lines. Hold on one second. Yeah, so we don't know whether men have lost the ability to smell, use their sense of smell for attraction, or whether yes, they never had it in the first place.
Mm.
But it seems to be that only women, and it's not. I need to make this clear because I get a lot of this on sort of social media saying, "But I really like my husband's aftershave," or "I really like the smell of his armpits," or something, or "I'm a bloke and I really like the smell of my girlfriend." And it's like, yeah, okay, I know that. It's not just generally smell, and you don't even know you're doing it.
Mm.
But women have an ability to smell genetic compatibility or incompatibility. Now, obviously, when we select a partner, we don't want somebody who is too genetically close to us because that leads to inbreeding problems and therefore, problems with any offspring. And so women have evolved to be able to smell a level of compatibility in relation to a particular set of genes. And that's the major histocompatibility complex. And that set of genes underpins your immune system. And women can smell how close somebody is in terms of genetic distance, in terms of their AMHC compared to the woman's MHC. And the further somebody is away, the nicer you will perceive them to smell. And the reason why it's a smell thing is because some of the genes which underpin the MHC also underpin development of the sensors in the nose, bizarrely. So that's why it's a smell thing. That's why you have smell and immune system crossing over. And as I say, men can't do it. We think women might be able to do it or have retained it because the consequences for a woman of getting it wrong are much bigger than they are for a man. Because if a woman becomes pregnant by a man who is too genetically close to her, she is out of that game for at least 9 months. If the baby is born and it has got some developmental difficulties because of it being, that is something that she's going to be focusing on for years, and she won't be able to reproduce during that time. So from an evolutionary point of view, she has cut herself out of the reproductive game. Whereas for a man, you can do that, and I'm afraid sperm isn't really very energetically expensive, and it doesn't bind you to a particular situation for a long time. So we think women might, and this is just a hypothesis, women might have retained it or developed it because of the fact the consequence is much larger for women than it is for men.
You mentioned myths earlier, and one of the myths, I don't know if it's a myth or maybe it's true, but that men and women experience breakups differently and that it's much more difficult for men and they struggle, right? Is that true?
No, I don't think so. I think men might find it harder because we have this thing about men talking about emotions and talking about difficulty and just talking about relationships. Unfortunately, in our society, we don't really hear men talking a lot about relationships and talking about their feelings within those relationships. And certainly for the studies I've done looking at friendship, for example, it's not something that a lot of men talk to their friends about. For example, you don't go down the pub on a Friday night and have a really good in-depth chat about your relationship, whereas women do. I mean, it's one of the major topics of discussion. So I don't think it's necessarily that men feel breakups any differently, any less. They're no less distressing, they're no less difficult. I just think they don't talk about them in the same way, and we don't, in a way, let them talk about them in the same way. Men, it's all kind of like pull yourself together. Don't be a wuss. Get back out there on the game. Just go and find somebody else. And that is the attitude we have. Whereas, we have at the other end of it, we have this idea, which I don't think is even particularly good for women necessarily, of, women sitting on the sofa eating 4 tubs of ice cream and crying a lot. I mean, I just think these are all stereotypes. I think we all deal with it in different ways. Some people are genetically predisposed to feel social rejection stronger than others. So 2% of the population have a version of a gene which is known as a gain of function gene, which means that if you are rejected in some way, either socially by friends, but also by a lover, the consequences of that to you are much greater in terms of psychological pain and physiological pain than they are to people who don't carry that gene.
And this
So
is a genetic.
this is a genetic. This is a gene. It's known as gain of
Wow.
function gene, and it's so associated with the endorphin system. So it's associated with the neurochemical that underpins long-term love. And yeah, it's a small proportion of people who have it, 2%, but they will feel breakups so much greater than those of us who don't carry it. And it's not split along sex lines.
And it would take them longer to recover, or
Takes
the
them,
feelings of emotions would be so
their
intense?
emotions are much more intense. The psychological distress is much, much more intense. The withdrawal is much more intense. Yeah.
Okay, that's grim. Is it possible to test for that gene?
Yes, you can test for it, but you have to take part in afraid it's not commercially available, but you'd have to take part in a research project. But yes, you can test for it.
One of the things that's happening, okay, with the evolution of technology and relationships is the emergence of robots, right? And that there does seem to be a certain amount of excitement in some quarters that robots could fulfill the role that, for men in particular, that women have been fulfilling
Yes.
throughout history. What's your perspective on robots?
It kind of depends. I talk a lot about robots and I get asked a lot about robots. And I think it depends where we want them to sit in our lives. So there have been people who have tried to develop, so the question is, for example, could you ever have a proper, a real friendship with a robot? Could you ever love a robot? And I'm not talking about sex robots, they're a different thing. But could you ever love a robot? Could you have an intimate, loving, empathetic relationship with a robot? Could a robot become somebody who could care for your children or care for the elderly? Those areas where we let that technology into what I call the intimate relationships of our life, that worries me. Because love is a very, very complex phenomenon. And as I explained at the beginning, there's so many different factors that come into your experience of love. But one of the major ones is when you are with somebody who is a fellow human, there's kind of an absolute meeting and merging of mind and body. It's known as biobehavioral synchrony. I talk about it in the book, but very briefly, when you're with somebody who you love, your behavior comes into synchrony. We know that people match behaviors. You'll pick up gestures from your partner, you'll pick up little verbal tics, whatever they might be. But if we look inside the body, when you're interacting with somebody you love, your blood pressure, your body temperature, your heart rate all come into synchrony, even though you will have entered the room with different levels. And then if we look in the brain, your brain activations become identical and your neurochemical levels become identical. So what actually happens is two organisms become one. You literally become one operating system. And that's evolved to make sure you are as tightly bonded to that person as you can possibly be. And that is one of the definitions of love, is do we see biobehavioral synchrony going on? And we've seen it between lovers, we've seen it between parents and children, we've seen it between very close friends. You can't do that with a robot, just from the very basic of the fact that it doesn't have a wet brain. It does not have a wet brain. It does not have a heartbeat. It does not have any of the things. We don't know why we do this with other beings, but we do. And it's really important. Also, the idea that you could program a robot to have empathy. Empathy is a hugely complex cognitive phenomenon. Really, really complex. And how the hell you would program a robot to have empathy, I don't know. And also, empathy partly comes from life experience. It comes from living. It comes from knowing I've been there. I know how you feel, and I'm going to bring that life experience to empathize with you and support you. And again, how you get that from a robot that's just been made in a factory who doesn't have a life experience? Can you program life experience? I doubt it. And I spoke to a roboticist who is also a human behaviorist, an unusual combination, for my book, and she said, we're getting overexcited here. Yes, there are robots that can jump. There are robots that can walk. There are robots that could, I think one's recently done a painting that sold for some silly amount of money, who can paint. But none of them can do all of those three things together. She said, if you want a relationship with something that's not human, that is going to fulfill you, that's going to empathize with you, that's going to nurture you, get a dog. Dogs can do all of this in a much more complex way than a robot can. So robots as intimate companions, I'd struggle with, and I particularly struggle with them when we're suggesting we replace human care with robots for the elderly or those with additional needs. That terrifies me, because your relationships with humans based on biobehavioral synchrony are the things that bring you life satisfaction, are the things that underpin your longevity, your mental health, your physical health, your happiness. You know, if you replace that with a robot, the person you're caring for is getting absolutely none of that, and that will be to their detriment. You know, elderly loneliness is a major epidemic in this country. We do not want to exacerbate that by replacing the human care they do get with a robot that will give them none of that. So that worries me. I think, you know, if you want to, if they develop, you know, a domestic robot, hey ho, great, that'd be great, like that. You know, does the washing, does the hoovering, no problem. But I do have a problem with the use of robots in those relationships that underpin our humanity. I have a problem with that.
But also, your lover, your partner, it's their choice to be there. They've chosen to
Yeah,
be with you.
exactly. There's a major power imbalance problem. You know, they piss you off, you turn them off.
Yeah.
What's that about? You know, it's just from my point of view, the answer is just no. And I just think, you know, we have this thing with, and in fact, Stephen Hawking said this. You know, we have this thing with humans where we think if we can do it, if we're clever enough to do it, we should do it. No, just because you're clever enough to do it doesn't mean you should do it. You have to think very carefully about whether that is really something you want to introduce. Because as you've said with, you know, very minor comparison, but dating apps, once the genie's out, very hard to put it back.
Yeah, was that old line from Jurassic Park? I think it was Jeff Goldblum also said it in Jurassic Park. He said, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
No, absolutely, absolutely, and that's where we should be with sort of humanoid robots and relationships and things like that.
And then in terms of love and the future of love, what's your perspective? I mean, we've touched on ideas around where it's going. We don't really like, neither of us really are comfortable with the idea of robots. Um, but they will become ubiquitous, I suspect, in some capacity at some point in the future. Online technologies will keep interviewing. Are you an optimist in terms of the future of love, Anna? Are you romantic that it will?
I think it will. What worries me is we're not very good at learning lessons from the past, where whenever we get a new technology, we jump in with both feet, get terribly overexcited, then realize that actually it's got some really big drawbacks, so maybe we shouldn't have done that. You know, we did with social media. That's exactly what we did. Overexcited. Now we're going, ooh, actually, should 16-year-olds have social media? You know, should 14-year-olds have a phone? That kind of thing. I hope we've learned. I hope we take the good bits of the technology and we embrace those, and we learn not to embrace all of it without thinking. So there are some, you know, some advancements which I think would be helpful. You know, the more we learn about love, the more we learn about the genetics of love and the neurochemistry of love, the more, for example, we have the potential to develop interventions that help people who struggle with love. You know, lots of people do struggle with love, and that is, you know, not only hugely sad and leads to huge loneliness, but it's also, you know, not good for their health, not good for their well-being, and we need to help them. You know, it's not something I directly do, but I sort of associate with a number of charities who intervene with, for example, parents who can't bond with their children, and that's usually because that parent had a difficult childhood and was not given that nurturing environment that builds, you know, the brain that enables you to then raise your own children in a healthy way. And by learning more and more about love, we can help people. We can help them sort of break that cross-generational issue and help them to raise their children in a healthy way, for example. So there are many things that are positive. For example, you know, I've spoken before about love drugs. And love drugs are, again, one of these technologies which, if we jump in with both feet without thinking, we're going to get in a mess. But if we are careful and they are regulated, they can be helpful. You know, there are versions of some love drugs already in trial in America in marriage therapy. So it's a version of MDMA, which is ecstasy, but MDMA, when it's engineered in a certain way, replicates beta endorphin, and it increases, you know, your ability to gain the other person's perspective. It decreases conflict. It makes you more empathetic. And it's certainly, when given in a controlled environment, it helps in marriage therapy. Just pause the conflict for long enough that people can come together and start listening to each other again and start empathizing again. And it certainly seems to have had positive results. So that's a good thing. You know, that's a good thing. But, you know, if we let the MDMA-based love drug out onto the market willy-nilly in a commercial sense, then there are quite a few ethical issues with that. So, if somebody took the love drug and you started a relationship on that love drug and they took it, do you have a right to know that that love might be based upon a neurochemical adjustment to their brain? What happens if they stop? What happens if you're in a coercive relationship which you want to leave, but the person coerces you into taking it? So there are lots of ethical problems around it in a commercial sense, but again, there are clinical applications that might be quite helpful. So it's one of those things where we have to, again, really have a discussion about where the boundaries lie. Because the problem with love drugs in particular is love is a major commercial market. I mean, it's a billion dollar market. And if you could produce a love drug that, yes, helped people be more attractive, or, be the coolest person in the room, or, yes, help them, maintain their relationships, you could make a lot of money. So we just have to be a bit careful. But I think that's the direction we're moving in terms of, because of the amount of knowledge we have now.
And there are clinical trials that take place around MDMA, right?
Yes.
And they have returned favorable results in terms of, like you said, bonding people together.
Yeah.
And I think in the book, if I remember correctly, you do reference the fact that when somebody comes off the MDMA, there was a gentleman that was dating a girl, and he came off, and then he didn't feel like, and that was a very, very unpleasant experience.
Exactly. And that's one of the ethical issues is if you start taking this and you meet someone while taking it, does that mean you take it for the rest of your life? Because what happens if you stop? Or, and also, do you tell them? Because in that particular scenario, he hadn't told her what happened. And he wasn't taking a love drug, he was taking ecstasy. But ecstasy has the same effect. And neither of them realized that, if he came off it, that would happen. And it did. And she'd shifted her whole life across a whole continent to live with him. He decided that ecstasy was not going to be in his life anymore. And suddenly his whole feeling towards her in the relationship shifted. And that's a pretty major consequence of it. So there's a lot more research that has to be done. Also, the other thing to say is some people, you give them the dosage that that is efficacious for a lot of people, no effect at all, literally no effect. So it wouldn't work for everybody anyway.
Yeah. But I mean, you inferred, or you hinted the fact that it's worth exploring, and you're happy that clinical trials are taking place.
Yeah, I think it's worth exploring. I think it's worth exploring in the clinical space. Yeah.
In the clinical space.
In a controlled clinical space. I think if it breaks out of that space, it might be quite difficult to control, and I think it might have consequences which aren't very pleasant.
And so you're an optimist in terms of the future of love. You're an optimist. Like, we can declare today that Anna Machin is an optimist.
I think I'm an optimist because also love's been around a heck of a long time, and I'm sure we've been through ups and downs in its history, and it always sticks around. So it'll be fine. And love itself fundamentally hasn't altered for millions of years, so it's fine.
And what does the future hold for Anna Machin?
Well, a couple of things. In my love research, I'm actually just really exploring now, looking at neurodiversity and love. So looking at ADHD and autism and love. A lot of the neurochemistry that's implicated in ADHD and autism is the neurochemistry that underpins love. A lot of the same genes are involved. There's a lot of research in that area at the moment, as the impact of being autistic, being ADHD, and the impact that has on your experience of relationships, your likelihood of finding love, how you manage those relationships, all that sort of thing. So that's a really interesting area because there's a major crossover between the two. And then in my other life, which we haven't talked about tonight, I research fathers. And I'm just hopefully, when I get around to it, just about to start writing my second book on fathers. So yeah.
And there's a great TED talk you do where you talk about dads and the importance of dads. And I'm going to put a link to that TED talk, as well as a link to your book, in the description box, because I think it's very powerful and very reaffirming indication of the roles fathers play in children's life. So, Anna Machin, thank you so much. I loved your book. I hope everybody reads it. I found it really, really interesting, and I found the conversation fascinating as well. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.